Welcome to Ferment Radio, a podcast series on bacterial and social fermentation. Fermentation can incite social action, spark creativity, and bring surprising new tastes to our lives. My name is Aga Pokrywka, and I invite you to join us in a conversation on living interconnectivities, from macro to micro, from societal to cellular, and from global to personal. A healthy food system encourages the production and consumption of food that support a balanced gut microbiome. It reduces food waste and gives preference to natural preservation methods. It uplifts food not only for its nutritional value, but also as cultural heritage and an expression of diversity. It is also mindful of the energy spent in order to process food. All these characteristics of a healthy food system sound very much like a definition of fermented foods. It may seem like a simple solution, but diagnosing and improving the complexity of food system, which is both global and fragmented, is a huge challenge. There are not many people in the world who can say that have extensive hands-on experience working in different areas of that vast system. David Zilber is definitely one of them. From a butcher shop in Toronto to the Fermentation Lab of the acclaimed restaurant Noma, Copenhagen, and to the labs of Hansen, a giant bioscience company in Hørsholm, Denmark. David Zilber has garnered multiple and fascinating perspectives on food and the system around it. Ferment Radio had the pleasure to talk with David in his own lab, where we reflected more about this incredible journey and his ever-evolving views on the food system that we are all part of. When I was coming here, I was like, I'm not going to ask you what you fermented first. You said you're not going to answer me the question, what was the worst thing you ever fermented? So I was thinking that we could go together into the big topic of food systems. What I find especially interesting in what I know about you is that you have professional experience with working in food system in a way, in very different places. You had to start somewhere, your career as a chef, then you were in Noma, which is quite high-end kitchen, let's say, and then here sitting in the lab, which is thinking about food system on quite high level, I would say, where the fermentation crocs don't have place anymore because these quantities of food will not fit there. Could you tell more about this journey and maybe your perspective, which was evolving while you were looking or participating in food system in these different places?
Yeah, I'd say that my job at Noma, when I first started at Noma, I wasn't hired as a fermentation expert or to work in the lab. I kind of let them know, in my cover letter, at least in my application, I kind of let them know, that I understood what fermentation is. I worked as a butcher for like 2 or 3 years back in Toronto, and I was responsible for like the charcuterie there. So I kind of stressed that and said, I kind of get this too. But when I started in 2014, I was just a cook in the kitchen, just peeling beets or cooking pumpkin and, mopping the floor, all of it. About a year in, or a bit less than that, Dan Giusti, the old head chef, and Renee and Lars Williams, who was running the Fermentation Lab with Ariel Johnson at the time, I guess they kind of had a powwow and were like, okay, if Lars and Ariel need a second hand, it might as well be Dave, because he seems to be, clever enough to be able to handle this. And when I got into the lab, first of all, I had no idea what any of this was. As a cook, it's hard to really kind of communicate properly how foreign these techniques were, even just 10 years ago, to your average chef. You would reach for sauerkraut if you were making, like duck confit. If you had to make like a dashi in an Asian restaurant, you would of course reach for shoyu or katsuobushi, but you never thought of these things as like, oh wow, this is a fermented product, and this is how it's made, and this is why it's made. They're just recipes. They're just ingredients. You don't think about it any more than you would think about, the intricacies of what it takes to grow a tomato. You know what I mean? You don't think about that in the day-to-day in a restaurant. So when I got into the lab, I was just completely unprepared for the world I was stepping into. But I caught on quick, and it was to, Lars and Renee and Dan's credit, it was like they picked someone who could catch on quick and kind of, finish my instructor sentences after the first couple of weeks, where I started to understand how these things fit together. It started to make sense, like, okay, this is the world of bacteria. These are the things they do. This is the world of fungi. These are the things they do. This is how enzymes fit into both these categories. This is what the citric acid cycles for, so on and so forth. And so it didn't take long until I was, doing the production, managing the interns, freeing up Lars and Ariel to do other stuff. Ariel was working for Matt a lot at the time, and Lars was being stretched all sorts of ways, like helping Renee open new restaurants and things like that. But at the end of the day, I had a very kind of fun and special job within a very fun and special restaurant. You know what I mean? I remember, like Renee, when I first started in the laboratory, like threatened me. He like cornered me in the test kitchen. He's like, you have to innovate. You understand me? He's like, you're not just taking this job. It's not just some cushy job. You have to innovate. I'm like, yes, sir. And, when I kind of told Lars about that experience, he's like, don't worry, Dave. We're fine. So long as we stick to our mandate, which is to make cool shit, we'll be fine. And that's what we did. No one ever complained about, the lack of productivity in the fermentation lab. We were up to stuff all the time, whether that was with Lars and Ariel or after them, with my team. We were intensely productive, just investigating whatever we could. It became a game to try to wow the test kitchen, which is a great incentive to have to go to work and create every day. But I will say, to actually get to the answer of your question, the longer you work with microbes and the more intimately you begin to understand them and their needs when you apply them to this or that situation, this or that crock, this or that ingredient or substrate or whatever it might be, the more you begin to see the echoes of the relationships kind of spill out outside of the doors of your laboratory or experiment and echo into the world around you. At Noma, we were responsible for experimentation, of course, but once you came up with a successful experiment, we were also the only people who could make it. You know what I mean? We had the equipment to bring it into the world the first time, but then after that, it's not like we could just hand it off to the cooks in the kitchen and have them, ferment their own koji. That had to be done in the lab. So when I started working fermentation very deeply, I always had to wrestle not with just the joy of doing it for fun or for my own entertainment or my own enjoyment in the kitchen. But I also had to, on a small scale at least, for 100 people a day, 500 people a week, that's not nothing. I had to understand how to make it consistently and reliably. And that is, for a team of 4 people, kind of the perfect training ground. It's not big enough that it's super high stakes, you're going to lose someone tens of thousands of dollars if a batch goes wrong. But it's also not small enough that you're not exactly learning quickly. You know what I mean? Because fermentation for, the even the kind of enthusiastic amateur is a very slow learning curve if you're only going to make 2 misos a year and work your way through it. You know what I mean? It's it takes a long time for you to understand all of the control points. But at Noma, you make your mistakes quickly, and again, you learn and you intimate this relationship to microbes very fast through repetition. And I'm amazingly fortunate to have gotten that experience. But like I said, when those microbes do intimate their needs to you, and you do start to kind of like almost anthropomorphize your relationship to them. Even though it's not like one single entity, it's a species or a set of organisms or, you know, a genus or a class of life that you get to know. Again, you start to see those echoes kind of spill out into the world. I always say that there's an amazing instruction about, you know, the threat of global warming, or, you know, the heat and the smog of like Los Angeles or Mexico City, you know, in the summertime on a freeway that's packed with cars. You think of that moment when you see koji that was fed super polished, high quality, you know, short grain sushi rice cook itself to death. When you come in the morning and it's like 45 degrees and it's done, like it's something else is starting to grow. The koji has had so much of a good thing that it's now killed itself, and you're like, oh man, we're not so different after all, are we? That's just one example, you know. But there's so many incredible instructions about contamination, about complexity, about control, about the nature of boundaries, about the nature of give and take that these microbes teach you, not just through this like methodical practicing, but like you kind of embody their answers. You know what I mean? You taste the results. Is the most intimate way of knowing something to be true, is to put it in your mouth and say, oh, I understand what happened here. This is physicality, you know, writ small, but also writ large. So yeah, I mean, flash forward to 2020, the pandemic makes restaurants make no sense. No one's closed for over 6 months. And I'm like, yeah, I've, you know, put in my time here. Maybe it's time to do something else. And I jumped ship. I didn't have an answer as to what I'd be doing once I left Noma. I just knew it was time to go. But as luck would have it, Christian Hansen was reaching out to collaborate on a project, I believe on African fermentation. Like after I'd given my notice, I think I had like 2 weeks left. And I'm like, sorry, I'm on my way out, but you're more than welcome to work with my predecessor if you want to run experiments with us. And then they're like, oh, well, in that case, well, one of the amazing kind of application scientists here, one of the more renegade application scientists, Christian, his name is. He's like, in that case, maybe we should have a meeting. Maybe this could turn into something else. And it turned into this kind of ongoing collaboration. I'm not formally their employee. They give me a lot of leeway to kind of do my own thing and work with other companies, which is great. So I'm here Monday to Wednesday. I'm across the street from their headquarters, where they have all of the hardcore R&D facilities. You know, they have a kind of a pilot plant for dairy production, and the fermentation of milk and yogurt and cheese. All the offices, you know, like the VPs and, you know, the chief scientific officers, you know, are housed across the street. But I'm here in my lab in another building that's not owned by Christian Hansen. They just rent out the ground floor for me, so that I have free reign to work with whatever I want. You know, it's like weeks upon weeks of like HACCP applications to bring in new types of microbes, especially fungi, across the street. But here I'm just...
You do whatever you want.
Yeah, which is pretty great. And I will say that the stakes are high now. You know what I mean? It's like if an experiment goes wrong, that is tens of thousands of dollars or euro of someone else's money, and someone left, you know, with the bill, if I don't make sure that I've, you know, double checked my answers or my work, you could say. But it is very different work. It's not just about making cool shit now, even though I guess you could kind of come to the conclusion that's still what I do. But I very much now work with the end in mind. You know, I'm coming across very specific briefs that are either created in-house here at Christian Hansen with a team of other scientists and my boss, who's more of a kind of business-oriented, even though he's worked in fermentation with his hands for years himself. You know, we kind of come up with great avenues, if you will, for Christian Hansen's microbes to get a place in the food system. I had an interview here with someone, like Christian Hansen's so big, it's thousands of people in the company. So there's the need to kind of communicate internally. And so I had one of these in-house interviews so that they could put it onto their kind of homepage and be like, hey, this is what David Zilber's up to in the lab. And in the interview, after rattling off like a succession of projects that I'm working on, Karen, who was interviewing me, was like, why does it seem like everything you work on has like a positive spin to it? I'm like, it's not spin. It just so happens that fermentation is just really good at making the world a better place. Whether that's the fermentation of seaweed to have a carbon negative animal food source for livestock, or the fermentation of processed foods like plant-based meat alternatives to make them more appealing to customers, or even like the really simple recipes where it's like, hey, a small producer kept having batches of their kimchi go off. Is there something you can do to help? And sometimes it is pie in the sky dreaming. Sometimes it is, hey, we're a giant food company and we want to get into this fermentation space. We don't have a lot of experience. What do you see in our product line that could be fermented into something cool? Whether that's like pizza sauce or, a way to fit fermentation or the flavors of sourdough into a very industrial, like bread manufacturing plant in a way that actually does some benefit to not just their bottom line because they get to say, hey, we have fermented sourdough now. No, because you're actually making the food healthier for people or tastier, and that's pretty amazing in itself.
So basically your work is very much these days like a problem oriented. There is something to be solved and you need to figure it out. Do I understand well, or do I imagine it well?
Exactly. And that's what I mean about working with the end in mind. At Noma, I had no idea what I would find. You come in, you're like, scratch your head, you look for inspiration in the world, you read some books, you're like, oh, I could try that. I could take this technique and apply it to gooseberries or sea buckthorn or, mulberries. What would I get out of that? What does mulberry nukazuke taste like? You never know until you try it. Here, no one's asking me to do that. Here it's like, hey, if we can ferment this and get, 12 extra days of shelf life in a grocery store,
right,
we'll reduce food waste on this product by like 50%.
Can you already see like some of the stuff you've been researching on already kind of getting into industry, for example, or it's still such a novelty that you didn't witness it yet?
Yes, I get a lot of requests from big companies who want to kind of capture Noma's magic in a way. Like they understand the potential. Even people who've like been to Popple to taste the veggie burger I've came up with at Noma, and they're like, I've had that and it's incredible. And I get that it's a lot of work to make, but like, how do we make our version of that? So there's a lot of people that are coming to Christian Hansen, knocking on the door to speak to me, for things that no one's ever done before in food production. And that's really cool, but it's also very difficult because when you actually explain to them what it takes to, pre-ferment a base with bacteria, then grow a fungus on it, and what that looks like at scale, you scare a lot of people off because the Western world is not set up for or used to or has the capacity to execute or even understand some of these ferments that are super commonplace in other parts of the world. And even when I have enthusiastic researchers from R&D departments of large food companies, I'm being purposely vague here because I have to sign NDAs to work with these people. So I have to be somewhat general in talking about some of my work. Even when I get enthusiastic, like food scientists coming to me, sometimes I know that the conversation is dead in the water when they have to go up the chain to whatever boss is responsible for the Q4 bottom line or the plant manager or the marketing team or whatever. So it's tough. But I've also come to learn that that's how the fight gets fought at this scale. A lot of people, when I first started, I got to meet this amazing application scientist here at Christian Hansen named Frank, who was German, but was responsible for like Latin America, which is a funny mix. So he spent a lot of time like traveling through Brazil and Mexico, and spoke Spanish and Portuguese super fluently, but was like, he was old school, you know? And he warned me, he's like, you know, you try and do things at Christian Hansen and you'll feel like a mouse trying to like steer a container ship sometimes, but keep at it. Keep at it. You'll get a lot of no's. And then eventually, you know, years down the line, you might get a yes, and your boss will act like it was his idea the whole time in the first place. He's like, but don't lose hope. And don't get me wrong, I've had projects that have come to fruition. I've had products that ended up being eaten by hundreds of thousands of people, you know, months after I put them, I send off the recipes. So that's super cool. You know, it's those kind of sparkling moments that at least give me the fuel to continue down this path, because it shows you that change is possible, even if it's difficult.
What's the biggest issue of a food system as we have it now? And can we even talk about it in this planetary scale? Is really food system something which is global, or it's more like fragmented?
It's both. There is a global food system, and there are also fragments of nested, much more local, much more individualized systems of food production. And I can guarantee you that there's some that are completely disconnected from the companies and the food sources that we interact with, as you, a resident in Helsinki, or me in Copenhagen, whatever it might be. But there absolutely is a global food system. And even if you argue that it's somehow not total, it's still, the fact that things are happening at such scale in you know, so many parts of the world, whether that's, you know, the decarbonization of American soil, the raising of the Amazon rainforest for beef or crop production, the depletion of wild fish stocks, it's all connected. And when one giant part of the world suffers like nutrient or resource collapse, you know, there are myriad ways that those knock-on effects kind of ripple throughout the global system. Funnily enough, I had a really fun airplane buddy that I sat next to on a trip back from Rioja. I was visiting some wineries there, and she recognized me when she came to sit down. I was like, "Oh, hi," and she's like, "You're David Zilber." I'm like, "Yeah," and I'm like, "Oh boy, okay, here we go." And she's like, "No, I think you're super cool." She was Spanish, and she's like, "I work for the United Nations, and I'm a marine biologist." And we had like this whole conversation for the hour and a half trip back to like about like fish stocks. And I was like getting ready for some bad news, and I was pressing her. I'm like, "How is it going? Like, should we not eat shrimp? Should we do all this? Should we do all that?" And she's like, "European fish stocks are doing great. Like, believe it or not, they're actually rebounding. Like, a bunch of countries have signed pacts and agreed to monitor, and they are on the mend." She's like, "But what you don't see is the fact that while we can pat ourselves on the back for that, Europeans themselves still have access to a global market that's unregulated. And just because you no longer have access to fish for endangered or depleted stocks that are grown in Europe doesn't mean that they can't still be imported or mislabeled and sold in those same environments while you deplete, you know, or destroy oceans out in the South China Sea or off the coast of South America." And that's what I mean, you know. You might think that you're eating locally. You might think that you're doing the good thing. But you don't see how, you know, kind of the holes that you leave in the system get filled by other products. And not even other products, other metabolites in ecosystems, whatever it might be. I always say that just because you can afford to do something doesn't mean that someone else can. I need to explain that a little bit. Just because you can afford to eat something that's like, you know, completely free range and requires 3 times as much land to produce, or, you know, is completely biodynamic or organic, just because you can afford, because you can pay the extra premium to have that form of food production exist. What I'm not saying is that someone else can't afford what you have. I'm saying sometimes you don't see the ways in what is afforded to you costs someone else. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally.
What do I think the food system needs to do? It's I don't know. To me it feels impossible. I think it needs to be more decentralized. I think it needs to be transparent, which feels impossible. It's like you look at a package of processed food and you see made in whatever, Spain, Vietnam, for imported food or whatever, or made in America, some sort of plant-based substitute, whatever it might be. And you see a list of ingredients, E numbers, refined acids, buffered vinegar, who knows what it might be. You have one point of origin for a finished product, and you have no idea where anything that went into that product came from. The food system is blind to its own inputs, especially when foods become commoditized and when you have, this constant aggregation of small farms or small producers that end up selling to conglomerates or wholesalers. When you have foods themselves being treated as like future options on stock markets so that companies can assure, a steady price in a completely unsure world. So that their bottom line can't like fluctuate against like their kind of future. It's pretty insane. All the things that food has become beyond food. We would be better off if all of that went away, if the food system was more decentralized, if people ate the things that grew in their surroundings in the seasons in which they grew, you know what I mean? And if we learned to just do without the one amazing thing that we tasted that one time. I think fermentation speaks to that in a really powerful way, because you can have the flavors of soy sauce, you can have the flavors of amazing French cheese with stuff that comes from where you are. And yeah, it makes food delicious and it makes it last. Like it solves kind of all the problems that exacerbate, kind of the human predicament on Earth, at least as it pertains to agriculture. But it's a hard sell to make that vision I have for the global food system a reality, because I don't even know where to begin.
When you said that what food system needs is to for sure be more decentralized, therefore to work on more local levels, it made me think that what is more local than, for example, wild fermentation, because it's inhabited by the microbes which are even in this room, or on your hands. So it's really like even micro local scale, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But in a way that I mentioned wild fermentation, so it's a process which is more spontaneous. But when we work in a laboratory, and we sit here right now in a laboratory, it's pretty controlled process, right? Or at least it is meant to be controlled, at least.
We're sitting in a laboratory of one of the world's largest bacterial culture producers.
Exactly.
It is in every essence the opposite of wild fermentation.
Exactly. But still, it could serve as a solution to some of the kind of bigger problems in the food chain as we have now. And I really need to ask you about what I am always, when you mention, I'm like, yay, tell us more about processed foods and fermentation. Is there a way to bring back from the, unhealthy section which processed foods belong to, and through fermentation bring back there, or some of the kind of a healthy benefits of foods?
I am a champion of like whole foods, not the grocery store, like whole ingredients. There's 2 shelves here that you can see just to your right, in my lab. The bottom is nuts and like dried berries and seeds and dried mushrooms. They're things that I use to like build umami and flavor or incorporate fats from like a first principle sort of, if I'm recipe testing. oh, can we make a really amazing nut-based cheese? Or what does this nut act like if it's fermented with X, Y, or Z microbe? And on the top is when I get further into recipe development and I have to kind of acquiesce to the rigors of industrial food production. Then we're getting into potato starch and tartaric acid and isomalt and carrageenan and alginates and refined de-aromatized shea butter or coconut fat. And that's the shelf I like playing on less. But ultimately I have to. Emulsifiers, binders, cellulose fillers. It is so far from the way I learned how to ferment. But it's also kind of reminiscent to the world of molecular gastronomy that took cuisine by storm when I first started cooking. My very first restaurant that I ever worked at, Rain, it was Pan-Asian cuisine. We used fermented tofu. We would just, get that from the Asian grocer and then mix it into the jus at the last minute. Had the most amazing sauce. But at the same time, we also had a cook who just come back from like 2 seasons at Albuli and was teaching us how to make, like spheroid gels and stuff so that we can take these flavors and then completely transform them into something that no one had ever experienced. Foams and things like that. And it's looking back on it. I mean, I started cooking back then. I thought everything was like the coolest thing, but looking back on it, it felt like such a paradoxical dichotomy, But ultimately, that's kind of the way that the world still works. Ultimately, that's what modern fermentation is. There's no need for us to ferment anymore. In most kind of grocery stores, at least here in Copenhagen, you can find an aisle of like pickles and fermentation that's kind of mixed in with other canned goods that are just like high temp pasteurized, low acid or no acid, but they're just as inert. You know what I mean? You can get lacto-fermented pickles right next to like canned button mushrooms that are just sitting in their own water.
Right.
That will sit on a shelf and survive the next apocalypse, honestly. And it's only through the advent of these incredibly hyper-industrial processes that we can do that we can preserve and hold on to food without the action of microbes. So in the context of like processed foods, it's like this really roundabout question. You know what I mean? It's like, even though maybe going back into the early days of pasteurization, let's say even like post-industrial revolution, like we're talking, let's say like 1950s, 1960s, when things really ramped up. We could have, humanity, in rich countries, could have eschewed the flavors of fermentation because we don't need to make food like that anymore. We didn't need to make food like that anymore. We could have said, no, we can just have like canned cabbage. And if you want it sour, you can add whatever acid you want to it afterwards. No, but we still make sauerkraut in huge quantities, and sell it then pasteurized on the shelf in the grocery store. It's like hyper confusing, but it's because we love the flavor so much that these once, kind of homestead and wild and traditional practices become industrialized while kind of holding on to that fragment of the true self, if you will. And I'd argue that, more people would still enjoy eating industrially produced sauerkraut alongside or on top of their frankfurters or alongside their mash or in their, cheese toasty than just canned high temp pasteurized cabbage, because it just tastes better. I'm sorry, it does.
But it also makes you feel better, right? The feeling is different when you eat it.
That's for an episode 2 podcast if we want to get into that. But yes, you're absolutely right. The really funny part is that in this new world. You know, in the 90s, we had tofurkey and, you know, all of these kind of like the veggie ground round and all these meat substitutes that were fringe. This was before being vegan or vegetarian was cool. You know, if you had this in your lunchbox, you were like looked at with like a queer eye, if you will, because it seemed like off. It's like, why are you eating that? Mm-hmm. Are your parents hippies? Like, what's up? Now, you know, with the birth of phrases like flexitarians or, you know, like veganuary or whatever it might be, there's more and more acceptance for plant-based foods. I mean, hell, Burger King is launching, whether it's a PR stunt or not, entirely plant-based restaurants. And there's an understanding that if we're to survive on this planet, there can't be more cows than people. So in the world of plant-based substitutes, yeah, there's a lot of work being done to make these products as good as possible. I'm not a huge fan of how they're made. To me, they seem like Frankenstein, like very pale simulacra of the real thing that in many ways cannot and never will be the real thing. Like, you're fundamentally starting from a different place. And while you can get close, you're not ever going to cross. Like, you'll forever be in the uncanny valley. You know, we can have conversations about cellular agriculture, forgive me. That's a different topic. And then you are growing animal cells. No, but that's a whole other beast. But as it pertains to, you know, like the recipes that are formulated with things like texturized vegetable protein, whether that's soy or fava bean or peas, basically the kind of core of recipes like the Impossible or Beyond Burger. To me, the funny thing is that everything that goes into those recipes, that comes off the second shelf. Like, you can see right there, I'm pointing to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 silver bags that look like they could contain pharmaceuticals. Mm-hmm. Like, they look like bags that you would find in like a doctor's office in a cupboard or something, right? That's everything to make a prototype veggie burger that you would find for sale. You just have to add water. And after you add water, it can and will rot, don't get me wrong. Because, I mean, it's full of protein and starch and sugar, spices, things like that. But those can sit inert on a shelf for years. And it's not until you mix them and add your drop. It's like Willy Wonka's chocolate factory, honestly. It's not how I like to make food. You know, I contrast it with what I did for the Noma veggie burger. Take quinoa, ferment it with bacteria first to pre-sour it. Cook it, add your rhizopus. The rhizopus grows, knits it together. The quinoa is just al dente. You know, it actually takes a deft hand to cook quinoa really well. It's cooked just al dente. It has the perfect kind of texture in your mouth. The mycelium weaves its way through. It acts as a sponge so that when you finally cook it, it's soaking up oil and fat from the pan. You know, you make an amazing glaze that's also going to get taken up. It gets super juicy. You smoke that glaze so you have the flavor of like fire in your food as well. You add, you know, fermented yeast, so you're slicing open, you know, cells that are basically as close as you can get in the unicellular world to an animal. And you end up with all this flavor, all this texture, everything you like eating about a hamburger in something that never purports to be a hamburger. You look at the patty, it's white and fluffy. You don't ever think, oh, this is going to be just like the burger I had at the steakhouse last year. No, it looks completely different. You're coming from a completely different starting point. But when it's actually in your mouth, it satisfies you for all the same reasons that a beef burger is satisfying. Not because it is a beef burger, or you can't tell the difference. You can tell the difference, but you don't care. That is good food. That is good plant-based food. Plant-based foods can be extremely satisfying. You know, I normally cook vegan for me and my girlfriend, you know, a couple or a few times a week, meals at least anyway. Because I don't need to reach for anything else. You know, I usually just It's not to say that I don't go to the really good butcher down the street and get great cuts of meat when I want to eat, like roast chicken thighs or whatever. But if it's like ramen or udon, I never need to reach for. I can make my, seaweed dashi. I can load it with shiitake mushrooms. I can hard sear, a whole head of enoki and then slice into it like it's steak. And then there you go, But industry doesn't like those sorts of answers. Like I said before, it's very hard to convince companies that have worked in one way to do things differently. If you don't need to use the kind of disassembly line of an abattoir to produce any of these kind of plant-based offerings, then you can just buy from an ingredient manufacturer or refinery all those silver bags, bring them into your warehouse, and then just clean down your line. And in the last step where you would actually pump out sausages or burgers, throw everything into a mixer that you already have, because you would need that for the meat anyway, add your water, which you already have, and then pound out patties. Why would you invest in the capital required to make a fermentation chamber? Why would in your cold plant would you now have a hot room that on paper seems like a health risk? Oh no, we can't justify this. Everything has to be 4 degrees and that's the way it is. We can't have another place that's 30 degrees. Things will grow there. Yeah, that's exactly the point. Things are supposed to grow. It's very hard to convince companies that are used to hammering nature into submission that you should make room for nature to grow in their food. And so even though fermentation does have a role to play for all the same reasons that I talked about, making that veggie burger great, fermenting those substrates, bringing out umami, breaking down proteins into amino acids, creating chemical complexity, really, and reintroducing that into these concentrated, stripped down, highly refined versions of nature that exist in those silver bags. Yeah, adding microbes to the mix brings complexity back in. And it helps alleviate some of the problems of concentration that come along with, isolating protein from soybeans. Yeah, you're isolating protein, but no one's going to pay for a protein isolate that's 99.9% pure, because it would cost thousands of dollars a kilo. So in the kind of off-the-shelf version, you end up with all of these other molecules, things that come part and parcel, even broken down proteins that end up in peptides that your mind registers as bitter or off-flavored. You can't get those out at reasonable cost in the ingredients that most of the industry uses to produce these kind of newfangled alternatives of highly processed foods.
When you describe it, it sounds like something quite simple became extremely complex.
Yes, it has. Yes, it absolutely has.
And for the sake of what?
I don't know.
That we should stop to eat meat, or there is something else in there.
I really do think that it's like Ian Malcolm in Jurassic Park, my second favorite line of his in the movie, after life finds a way. Your scientists were so preoccupied with wondering of whether they could, they never stopped to ask if they should. I mean, I read the history of like texturized soy protein in the 1970s. It was like touted as like a potential industrial revolution. Like, this will change the face of the earth. We did it in a lab, and now, I don't know whether the dream of the possible future was ever weighted against the commonality of what already existed. What's so bad about tempeh? Why are the things that people have been doing for centuries suddenly not good enough to keep us alive today? They're simpler. They're tried, tested, and true. But I guess they're not sexy, and you can't acquire tens of millions of dollars of venture capital money to say that you're just going to start a farm or a fermentation factory or fermentory that's not doing anything new. I guess it's only sexy and it only becomes worthwhile when you say, oh, I have something revolutionary. I have something that's never been done before. It's a moonshot idea, but if it pays off, it could pay off big time and replace traditions with new traditions. The world of processed food is a weird one, It's rare that you see companies focused on like whole ingredients, which even at like industrial scale looks wild, but if there's only 5 things coming in and you end up with one product going out. That's still way better than the alternative version that uses all of these E numbers and refined chemicals to, have a shelf life that lasts for like 3 weeks, or a texture that people don't find aversive. Or
what is, like, back to your lab, what are the proportions of the things you are busy during the day? Because I imagine you need to research quite a lot. You need to make your hands dirty with stuff. You talk to people. Like, what are the ratios between those?
There's probably too much time spent answering emails and following along in threads and like making PowerPoint presentations. I'm not a huge fan of that. It's a corporation. That's just life in any corporate structure. It's not Noma. You can't go down the hall to, the ingredient sous chef and say, hey, I need this by tomorrow. He's like, yeah, no problem. The things need to be cleared. Is it in the budget? Have you checked with legal? That's just life. The experiments now, because they are kind of goal-oriented to solve specific problems, they're usually like very surgical. It's like, okay, this is the recipe. We need to attain this texture, or like have it, score yay high on like a sensory panel. Let's aim for that. And then you tweak a recipe that is not like I'm used to cooking. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, we're gonna ferment this for. It's usually like very discrete chunks of activity, either within like a process or like within someone else's recipe. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, this is what we have been doing. Where's the slot for fermentation? And I might do it like a shotgun test of maybe like 5-10 different microbes, figure out pretty quickly what the best one is, go back to them, do up a prototype, send it over. They weigh it, they get back to me. You know what I mean? It's like very like ping pong, like. And you kind of get to your answers pretty quickly. In terms of steps, it's very protracted in terms of time. So there isn't a whole lot of like active work. It's very different from the sort of R&D I used to do at Noma. And yeah, and if I put an experiment on here, I could be like, I could set it up and be like washed down in like 2 hours. And then the rest of my time is spent on like internal communication, It often helps to, I work with also like really great and curious microbiologists who are often sending me papers and stuff. And it's like, oh, hey, check out this amazing, study on the isoelectric effect of, fermentation on vegetable protein. Is this something we can tap into? And that sort of research is genuinely fun. It's dense, but it's fun. You definitely learn a lot on this job. But it's also usually in service of some of the most pie-in-the-sky ideas, even for this company, that take a long time to turn into reality.
But it also made me think that, in a way, we talked about this complexity of processed foods, but in a way, fermentation is all about simplifying the food, because it kind of puts things apart, right?
And sometimes builds things back up together.
Okay, so it's not so straightforward.
It's both destructive and creative, reductive and synthetic.
It's everything then.
It is the act of transformation.
It's very important to point out that the presence of fermented foods alone does not guarantee a healthy food system. Other factors, such as the availability of fresh food, access to clean water, sustainable agricultural practices, and equitable food distribution, are crucial components of a healthy and sustainable food system too. Wow, that was quite a journey. Thank you, David, for guiding us through the vastness and complexity of the food system through the lens of your experiences with fermented foods. But our journey with David Zilber is not over yet. We will soon release another episode of Ferment Radio, where we follow David even farther in the fascinating world of fermentation. Stay tuned. If you like this episode, please share it. If you would like to know more about the show, listen to this episode again, or find previous episode, please go to fermentradio.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and more. We would love to know what you thought of this conversation. Hear your human microbial stories and your suggestions for the future episodes. We are always looking forward to hearing from you at hello@fermentradio.com. You can also leave us an audio message by connecting to us on our Instagram. Ferment Radio is brought to you by Super Eclectic, and it's supported by Microbial Life's Practices of New Human Microbial Cultures, a project at the center of the social study of microbes. I'm very grateful for this support, and most of all, with all our amazing Ferment Radio listeners.